Welcome back to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. We're coming to you live from day 3 of the Singapore Fintech Festival. Joining me for this segment, we have Antony Cook. He's the Chief Legal Counsel in Asia for Microsoft. And we're going to talk about responsible AI and open banking. In fact, Microsoft just launched a series of white papers discussing this topic, and Antony's going to share some of the key conclusions from this. Thank you so much for joining us at the Singapore Fintech Festival. Now, when we talk about responsible AI, why is this so important for financial institutions?
Well, firstly, it's great to be here, and I think the importance of responsible AI is really being driven by a couple of things. I think firstly, quite frankly, just by adoption. We recently did a study with IDC, and there were 52% of financial institutions that were using AI in some form already, which was higher than the industry average at 41%. So you see just the pure usage of AI is requiring institutions to start to think about how they're using it. The second part is that you're seeing regulators in the region just really focus around the use of AI and how AI is being used. And in Singapore, we're seeing a pretty forward-leaning approach to that. So you have the Monetary Authority here that at the FinTech last year, in fact, launched a set of guidelines related to the use of AI in the financial services industry. And you've got the Personal Data Protection Authority here, which authored a broader set of guidelines. And so you've got that real focus, both from industry and from a broad regulatory perspective, that is asking the question of industry, and I think that's really driving the focus.
It's certainly encouraging for sure. Now, when we talk about this concept of responsible AI, what are some of the requirements for this to be put into practice?
And that's very much what we focused on in the paper, because I think what you've seen is you've got these sets of regulations or sets of guidelines. At the same time, you've got companies like Microsoft taking AI very seriously, and we publish our own set of principles. And so the key challenge is then how do you take those principles and translate them into practices? And that becomes something that you then have to focus on particular use cases. So in the white paper, we worked with Deutsche Bank, we worked with Standard Chartered, we worked with Visa, and we worked with the law firm Linklaters, and we took some very specific use cases and took them through the principles so that you could then start to see where the friction arises in looking at the different sets of principles. So we looked particularly at, and I'll just talk about, say, one particular use case, the AI that was used for Know Your Customer inquiries and validations. And so when we started to look and dive into that, then you start to see where the guidelines have challenges in the way they get implemented. And so that was sort of the key things that we focused on, and the report in the white paper shows some of the learnings from that.
Let's learn more about open banking and why you think it's poised to be the next wave of digital transformation within the finance sector.
And the fascinating thing about open banking is that it's one of those rare instances that you see regulation and the regulators actually pushing the industry. And so what's been so interesting, and I think at the same time as you have the regulators pushing the industry, you also have just the explosion of data and the relevance of data for banking institutions. And I think the financial institutions are being driven by this kind of more of a policy forum that says, look, driving forward open banking will create innovation in the financial services sector. It will create different ways of doing financial services, and it'll address things like financial inclusion, which is so important. And so as a consequence, that I think is driving, both the notion that there's all this data available and we have to look at these data issues, and a regulatory approach that's really forward-leaning is really going to create a lot of momentum in the open banking space. So
some of the trends that you were talking about, of course, was financial inclusion. What are some of the best practices as adoption continues to rise?
Well, I think you're seeing a real dichotomy of how some of the institutions within the financial services sector are dealing with open banking. Some of the people are seeing it as a real opportunity for innovation. They're seeing the notion that we expose data, that we can look at using a different ecosystem and partnering in different ways in the ecosystem. They're just seeing it as an opportunity. Interestingly, some of the incumbents are not finding that as easy because they don't necessarily have the flexibility of their own infrastructure, and they're looking at it more as a compliance obligation. And so what we do see that there's a big opportunity for incumbents to think about how they modernize their infrastructure, and then how they think about different opportunities in the ecosystem. And I think if they do that, then they'll find a whole bunch of different opportunities.
All right, Antony, thank you so much for sharing the insight. And thank you for joining us throughout the day on Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.